Today we have a special interview with Mr. Akashambatwa Mbikusita-Lewanika. He is a Pan-African revolutionary, convener and founder of the Movement for Multi-Party Democracy, and once upon a time National Secretary of the party, former cabinet minister and MP, former special political assistant to the president, that's President Rupia Banda, former managing director of Tazara, group director of projects for Indeco, community development activist, scholar, author, and prince in the Barotse land.
A live experience example, I was director of projects for Indeco. I set up Mansa batteries together with my colleagues, of course, and bicycle plant in Chipata and so on. And one of the things we discovered, having set them up there, on the pretext that we are taking development to rural areas, we are taking employment to rural areas, then you discover that for Mansa batteries, that the majority of the people we employed were the same people we came with from Lusaka and Kitwe to take them there. It was not local people. And that the people in villages, even those who were just one generation from living in villages, had forgotten that people in villages don't go around putting torches at night, move up to 10 p.m. or 22 hours or 12. No, by 20 hours everybody is home and they are settled, okay? So that there is no market for it. The manganese which was needed, we were able to collect it within a short period, maybe a month. And then we did not buy it from villagers or from anybody, we just collected them on certain hills. Because at that time in the late 1970s, manganese was not yet a commodity. Which means the local people did not even benefit that we bought something from them. And then we discovered that the economics of import substituting a dry cell battery was such that it is cheaper to have just used Forex to import a complete battery than to try to manufacture it. Like you import 10 different pieces and come and assemble them. It's more expensive. So that these lessons of the projects that I was involved, and I was involved in every province, there is no province, I don't have one or two projects which we put in, but they all had the same fault line. None of them took development to the village level. And in fact, most of them were economic disaster because they were built on an import substitution model which does not look deeply into the economics of it. That if we are trying to solve a problem of foreign exchange, importing 10, 20 pieces of a car and then assembling them in Livingstone is more expensive than to just buy a Fiat from Italy and bring it. Okay? And now whether the employment you have substitutes for that was also questionable because the number of people you are employing were so few. The vast majority of our people. I could even say that at independence, the Zambian economy was a middle-income economy. In Africa, the countries in Africa which were obviously better off than Zambia was South Africa, perhaps Rhodesia, Kenya not quite, Ghana not quite, perhaps Egypt. So Zambia was probably the fourth ranking economy in Africa at 64 as a middle income. Many years later, it was even under President Mwanawasa, so you can imagine we had KK for 27 years, we had Chiluba for 10 years, we had Mwanawasa for 5 years. Then we went back to economic planning. And what is the objective? That in 2030 we should be a middle income country. A status we had at independence. That also is a good indication of that. And during the management of the economy also, again, 68, 69, 70, we nationalized, particularly the mines and others. How did we nationalize them? With the compensation, then the same managers, the Anglo-American incumbent, we also gave them the management contract, which means whether you produce or don't produce, they get paid. And part of the management contract means they are the ones arranging imports, which means they could sell to themselves, they could transfer prices. A decade later, the mines collapse. Then we privatize them. To whom? The same people, forces that had them when we nationalized. So neither privatization nor nationalization works. And the reason it does, both of them don't work, is that they are both done under the same system, the same colonial system, which is dependent and sustainably dependent, which is under developing rural areas, and which is minimally connected to the rest of the economy. So that character continues up to today. Even when we say the solution to our economic problem, we bring investors, we want investors to come and to do business as usual, the same usual business that has failed to develop rural areas.
Thank you for giving us that background. So if we move forward now from 1964, we come to 1991, and you're actually the convener for a meeting where the establishment of the movement for multi-party democracy actually happens. You're a convener and founder. The question I've always wanted to ask you is, when we switched from one-party state to plural politics to democracy, we were letting go of everything that the one-party state represented.
The first president of Uganda said we should be non-aligned, but in all issues we should be non-aligned, but we should be neutral in no issue. In other words, we should still have a stand of our own, but it doesn't necessarily have to be in these two camps. So some of the African leaders, the Nyereres, tried to solve this problem that, okay, if we are not going to be communist or socialist, and we also don't like capitalism, let's look at the African system and come up with what ours. The Nyerere came up with Ujamaa. Okay? In Kenya, they came up with what they called African socialism. Indeed, when it came to implementing it, it was not quite clear whether it was socialist. One of our African leaders, Mohamed Babu of Zanzibar, wrote a book that, is it African socialism or is it socialist Africa? So that was the question, that Africans were not comfortable. Definitely they are not comfortable with capitalism, because that is basically came in a package of colonialism. They were also not comfortable with the antisocial element of capitalism. But they were also didn't want to, what Mboya said, we don't want to give up one master of Western colonialists for a new master of Soviet hegemony. So that the Africans were trying to find a middle path. I'm saying that to give a background that in the case of Zambia, then the idea was to come up, instead of saying African socialism, because the Kenyans had already taken that, instead of saying Ujamaa because it was Swahili, and Zambians are always scared to use our own languages, so we came up with humanism. Now, the people President Kaunda was working with, his buddies, his closest buddy, collaborators, in coming up with this, were Europeans, church people, reverends, Colin Morris and Marvin Temple. So they were first Christians. And of course they are Europeans, so they know the European history. that this word with a capital H, humanism, in European history is contrast with God-centeredness. In other words, humanism is man-centered in the European sense. So those who said they were humanists, they were also opposed to the church. So since these were church leaders, so basically they influenced their friend to say, no, it is a little difficult for you to adopt this word humanism, because as far as Europeans are concerned, if you say you are humanist, they think you are not God. Then of course Keke is a product of a mission station. Yeah. So he's also Christian. So they say, no, no. So we need a different humanism. So now it was not just humanism, it became Zambian humanism. To give us space to define it, and to define it in such a way that this humanism, this Zambian humanism, differs from the European historical humanism, because in this Zambian humanism, we believe in God. Okay? If you look at the stages portrayed on the way to humanism, for instance, there's also a very funny story I'll tell you about that. That you see, it follows the Marxist stages. That first of all you have a feudal state with serfs and feudal lords. Then you have a capitalist state with the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. Then according to Marxism, from that you move to socialism. And from socialism you move to communism. Now the humanism, the Zambian humanism as adopted, as defined in Humanism Part 1, because there were Humanism Part 1 and Humanism Part 2, was that you copy the same Marxist thing, that you start with feudalism, you go to capitalism, you go to socialism, then from socialism, instead of going to communism, because the communists don't believe in God, you jump to humanism, which believes in God. So that is basically the background of the human as a philosophy. So it was not a very deep philosophy. It was a reactive philosophy. And then also it was mechanized, that there were even posters that humanism is 1, 2, 3 up to 10. So you kind of memorize that. But whether or not those declarations were reflected in reality, because in this same Zambian humanists following government, you had political prisoners. You declared a one-party state under this same humanism, which means that in practice, this Zambian humanism was not even anti-colonial, because under this same humanist government, you continued with the state of emergency. Throughout President Kaunda's rule, there was a permanent state of emergency, which means at any time, the government was free to take away any of your liberties if it felt the need for. At first, at independence, the state of emergency we inherited at independence required that every 6 months or so, you should go back to Parliament. It lapsed and then you had to renew it. After 69, the Parliament, this humanist Parliament, declared that no, you don't have to keep coming. That the state of emergency can stay on permanently at the pleasure of the president. Now, I don't know how humanistic that is. That you should be able to be ruled by one man at his pleasure, you have a state of emergency or not. So that in practice, when you are talking about what were we criticizing and what were we trying to build when we were demanding the end of the one-party state? I don't think the one-party state itself was a true reflection of genuine humanism. It was a true reflection of dictatorship. and partisanship. So that we thought that in practice, forget what they are saying, forget what they sing in the national anthem. In practice, they are running a dictatorship. In practice, they are perpetuating the same state of emergency that was there in colonial days. They are perpetuating the same system of the economy. They are perpetuating the same style of leadership, which is top to bottom. When it was announced, when we were general managers, if you leave home in the morning, before you have heard that President Kaunda is holding a press conference, your own wife brought a radio to your office because it was a matter of life or death. Everything depended on that press conference. That's when people were fired, hired, imprisoned, whatever it was. So it was a reign of terror. There was nothing humanistic about it in reality. So that what we wanted to abandon was not the genuine humanistic part, but the non-humanistic part of this Zambian humanism, which perpetuated the ills of colonialism and which imposed the one-party state. Now, unfortunately, in the transition, we only changed one clause of the Constitution, which simply meant that instead of being banned from forming parties, now we can have political parties, different political parties in election. But the rest of the Constitution is the same one-party state Constitution. The rest of the governance system is the same top-to-bottom colonial system. The same economic system is the one that neglects the village in it. It's the same economic and governance system is the one that marginalizes our traditional authorities. And that looks down, doesn't pay attention to traditional authority. So that's what we were aiming to change. Unfortunately, we have not succeeded because it cannot simply be addressed by simply allowing people to have political parties. You can have 10 political parties, but if whichever party wins becomes another UNIP, whichever president goes to State House becomes another Kaunda, then you haven't changed much. But at least we promised. Just like at independence, the fight for independence was a promise that we address the colonial problems. The promise of returning to multi-party was that we will address the problem of the one-party state. Unfortunately, both promises have been broken. I wish I could end on a positive note, but...
No, but that's the truth as it is.
Yes. So the challenge, basically, the challenge of independence, the challenge of which we tried to redress by returning the country to multi-party, still continues. So the young people are challenged that maybe those who brought us independence betrayed it. Maybe those of us who brought you multi-party betrayed you. But you don't have to continue with a regime of betrayal. You will always have a chance to be the ones that bring about a change that answers the aspiration for independence, that answers the aspiration for returning to multi-party. Because multi-party, return to multi-party, one, it was part of the independence dispensation. So that declaring a one-party state was like a detour. So we came back, but the challenges are there and the opportunities are there, and they probably are better because if you really study our history, then you would know what it is that we intended to do, what it is we have failed and how we have failed. So this gives the new generation a chance to redress this situation for change, for freedom, justice and equality on a global stage, which itself will be a free society.
So, continuing on the same path, you've continuously referred to the underdevelopment of rural areas.
Yes.
We'll get back to that. There's something I'd like to ask you, now tapping into your experience as an economic development expert. When we talk about the haulage of goods in Zambia, the majority of the transportation of these goods seem to take place on the roads using trucks.
Yes.
You worked with Tazara for a while. We have an established railway network system. Why isn't it possible for us to use that system to transport the majority of these goods, heavy goods, in bulk and also cheaply?
By rail.
Yes, by rail.
Yes.
Why the emphasis on
Yes,
the use of trucks?
That is a very important question, because we should also go back that the railway line from Cape Town to Sakanya was built precisely to move the bulky copper to the market. So that throughout the colonial period, copper did not move by road. And when that rail system was threatened by the unilateral declaration of independence by Ian Smith in Rhodesia, Zimbabwe, it was thought to be so critical that we must find another outlet for the rail transport. And that's where the Tazara now comes into being. So that even the nature of this economy that I've criticized was built on railway transport rather than trucks. Now the trucks in terms of Zambia were introduced ironically that when the railway system was threatened in terms of possibility of it being cut off at the falls going to South Africa, going to Zimbabwe, then we had to import oil and export copper by road on a road that was not yet even built. So that is, in other words, it was supposed to be a temporal issue. And for that purpose, Zambia even created a parastatal, which was a Tanzania-Zambia road services or something like that, like a road version of Tazara for oil and transporting of copper while the railway was being built. So it was supposed to be a temporal measure, and now it became permanent